Welcome to GeekDIYMechanic. The purpose of this video is to briefly discuss a case study recently posted on the website discussing the implications of installing a cold air intake. From the homepage, let us navigate to Case Studies, Cold Air Intakes. This case study will focus on discussing how cold air intakes can affect PCM input sensor characteristics from factory specifications. For example, the MAF values can be altered enough that the model programmed in the PCM does not match the engine's physical model any longer. I have read many articles and watched several YouTube videos where the topic of how the installation of cold air intakes can affect a car from both mechanics and performance enthusiasts. Therefore, once I got my hands on a newer car with a cold air intake installed, I had to determine if it changed the PCM's model of the engine's characteristics. On both a 2007 Civic Si and a 2015 Subaru BRZ with cold air intakes installed, I attached my scan tool to the DLC port, and lo and behold, the short-term fuel trim was roughly minus 7% throughout the closed loop RPM band. Remember that at wide open throttle, the fuel system enters open loop. More on that later. So, it appears the installation of the cold air intake changed how the air flows past the mass air sensor and or through the intake manifold. Somehow, this change to the system caused the actual engine response to differ from the model defined in the PCM. The minus 7% short-term fuel trim indicates that in closed loop, the PCM is being told by the O2 sensors that the exhaust stream is too rich. It would appear that the PCM thinks there is more air entering the engine than there actually is. This would cause it to look up the injector pulse to a fictitious quantity of air. Thus, the PCM is encountering a rich condition, stimulated by the O2 sensors, and is responding by a lean response. The short-term fuel trim is moved negative, which reduces the fuel injector pulse width to get the exhaust stream back into proper stoichiometric ratio, 14.7 to 1. To understand what I think is going on, let's look at the air-fuel ratio graph to see how it affects power and fuel economy. In the middle is stoichiometric. This ratio allows the combustion process to be as thorough as possible. This makes sense. This is where modern computers try to keep the exhaust air-fuel ratio, since it allows the catalytic converter to be most efficient. But this ratio is not constantly maintained. Manufacturers are pressured for clean air, performance, and economy. So in cases where the car is cruising, the PCM will move the air-fuel ratio to around 16 to 1, lean, to achieve the best economy possible. When the driver stomps on the gas pedal entering the wide open throttle condition, the PCM will move the air-fuel ratio to around 13 to 1, rich, to achieve the best performance possible. So this is where my hypothesis begins. I propose that the installation of a cold air intake tends to make the air-fuel ratio richer. In closed loop, the PCM forces it to be under control. This is demonstrated by the short-term fuel trim going negative to remove additional fuel. But in wide open throttle, the PCM goes into open loop, meaning short-term fuel trim is not used. Therefore, it will result in a richer mixture at wide open throttle. This is where I propose that the air-fuel ratio is slightly pushed to an optimal ratio for the engine to possibly produce a little more horsepower. Modern cars are so well designed that moving the air-fuel ratio plus or minus just 0.5% can either add or remove horsepower. I feel this is why there is so much variation in the benefits of cold air intakes. In other words, some engines and PCMs are so tightly engineered together that modifying them will either reduce or increase horsepower. For example, it was proven on a dyno that installing a cold air intake on an RX-8 actually reduced airstream velocity, resulting in less horsepower being produced. Looking at the summary findings table, we will see that Scanner Danner doesn't care for them and has some examples of them hurting performance of the engine. Mighty Car Mods actually performs some dyno runs on forced induction and naturally aspirated cars to demonstrate very modest performance increases. Mustang 360 did some dyno runs on various cold air intakes for 2005 Mustangs. Their test demonstrated a performance increase of up to 10%. The reason I felt this topic needed to be addressed is that if you were asked to work on a car with aftermarket products installed, you might experience PIDs that are out of expected non-modified cars range, yet these values might be okay. For example, the two cars I previously discussed were running perfectly and all readiness monitors were all performed successfully. Yet, the short-term fuel trim PIDs were nearly the plus or minus 10% range. Remember, they were at minus 7%. So, if this knowledge wasn't known, one might try to chase down why the short-term fuel trims are out of the expected range, or very close to the non-valid range, close to 10%, plus or minus 10%. From my experience, not all aftermarket products are made to the quality of OEM products. In a similar fashion, other times the product is great, but the installation is not very professional. These factors might cause issues over time that could be difficult to track down. I have been told in the past, for these reasons, that many professional mechanics avoid working on modified cars. In summary, I'd like to highlight the following points. Modern cars are very well designed and modeled. When modifying modern cars, you need to consider the following. Government regulations like CARB. You won't always get great performance increases. Sometimes they will actually remove power. Not all aftermarket products are made to OEM specifications and quality. Not saying all are, just some aren't. The modifications performed might make it very difficult to track down issues. Remember the PIDs being out of what you might expect from factory specs? Professional mechanics may not work on your car or charge you additional time. Lastly, the jury is out if cold air intakes always improve performance. Thank you for watching. I hope you found the information helpful.